Welcome to this unit, questionnaires and other methods of data collection, covering chapters 8 and 9. So a questionnaire is a self-report data collection instrument. And what this means is it is a series of questions that we hand to our participants, and they, volunteer their opinions, their recollections, their feelings, their ideas related to the questions that we ask. But it's inherently self-report in nature. It used to be that these things were done paper and pencil. So at large research universities, the professor would say to the classroom full of 500 undergraduates, I'm interested in doing a study. If you'd like to participate, I'm going to pass around a survey. Or perhaps, standing at the mall or at the Taste, not the Taste of Chicago, Jazz Fest, those kinds of things where people are just sort of sitting around. We do paper and pencil surveys, but today most surveys are done using online systems like Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey. And these systems are far superior because they save you the step of doing data entry. So your participants, they answer their questions. You set up the questions in Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or something similar. The participants answer the questions electronically. And then what's nice about these systems is that you can then, from the back end, download an SPSS data set or an Excel file that has all of your data neatly organized and ready to go, as opposed to sort of having to manually enter in all the data from a paper and pencil survey. Your book makes this big stink about questionnaires not being surveys, that a survey instrument is a synonym for a questionnaire. But while this might be true in a technicality, practically speaking, people use the terms survey and questionnaire relatively interchangeably. So that's my opinion on that. So this lecture, this chapter 8 lecture, is about principles of questionnaire construction. And so we will talk about things to think about when you're developing questionnaires. But the first thing to know about developing questionnaires is you probably shouldn't do that. Before you begin doing anything, you really want to look through the literature and avoid trying to reinvent the wheel. Chances are someone has developed a survey instrument, has developed a questionnaire to measure the thing that you are trying to measure. And so you really want to avoid creating your own items if you can, because what you'll find is it's not actually very easy to do. And then when you come to the point of publication, your methodology is much stronger if you are saying in your method section, we use the Rosenberg self-esteem scale to measure self-esteem. Everyone says, your reviewers will say, oh, I know what that is. That's been shown to be reliable and valid by other studies, versus we made up these questions that we think measure self-esteem or we think measure this other thing. You just lose a little bit of benefit of the doubt from reviewers when you make up your own items. Now, if you are going to make up your own items, you want to think about, the purpose of the survey. So are you just trying to gather information, or are you trying to confirm? Are you trying to do a sort of hypothesis test? It's always a good idea to see what is out there, because, again, you don't want to reinvent the wheel. It's so much easier to just copy and paste a survey from a research article and then cite that in your methods. So you want to think about who your participants are, and you want to think about your participants in terms of making the questionnaire user-friendly. For example, if you're going to have demographic questions that ask about ethnicity, you want to make sure that all the possible ethnic identifications within your survey population are going to be represented in that question. Or if you're thinking about particular culturally appropriate language and those sorts of things. So you just really want to think about the survey items in terms of the people who are actually going to end up filling them out. And to this point, you want to use familiar and comforting, not comforting, but familiar language. Typically we shoot for about an 8th or 9th grade reading level in terms of our survey questions, which is about the average of the U.S. population. You want to avoid jargony terms that participants might not understand. So an example of this would be the word salience. The salient point of this argument is this is a word that gets used a lot in research, and it means that, something that stands out, but it's not something that typically gets used in the, standard lexicon. Lexicon is another word. So you want to use sort of natural and familiar language that participants aren't going to be scratching their heads over. You want them to be clear, precise, easily understood. You don't want to have participants wade through a paragraph, right? Short to the point questions. You obviously don't want to use leading or loaded questions where you are inserting your opinion or your perspective into the question. These kinds of questions convey to the participants that there is a particularly desirable or correct answer. Lazy employees who are always late for work should receive a reduction in pay. How much do you agree with this statement? Well, that's a loaded question or a leading question, right? That creates a particular response that is obvious. Well, of course we want to reduce the pay of the lazy people. And so you want to make sure you use neutrally worded questions. You want to avoid double-barreled questions. And actually, this is a big problem in survey creation. And it is something that once you're aware of it, you will start to see it all the time. I am one of those people who will answer the telephone and take, phone surveys because I believe in sort of research karma, and that, if I help someone out with their research, that will come around to my research. But I will infuriate the people on the phone because I will critique their questions. That's a double-barrel question, right? And a double-barrel question means that you have more than one thing in the question that you're assessing. Two or more issues. So do you as a parent elicit, or sorry, do you as a school principal elicit input from parents and teachers? Rate on a scale of 1 to 10 for how often you elicit input from parents and teachers. And the person indicates a 10. Well, what does that 10 mean? Does that mean that they're getting input from parents? Does that mean that they're getting input from teachers, or both? You can't really know. And that's what makes this double-barreled. So typically what you want to do is break this up into separate questions, right? Do you elicit input from parents? Do you elicit input from teachers? And then it's clear what the participant is responding to when they respond to that question. Obviously, you don't want to use double negatives. So again, this goes back to principle number whichever about making these things clear and concise. I disagree that teachers should not be required to supervise with the students during library time. Like, that's a head scratcher. What does that mean? Better to say, how much do you agree with the following statement? Teachers should not be required to supervise students during library time. Strongly agree, strongly disagree. And that's a pretty clear question. It makes it easy to answer. You want to think about using open-ended and closed-ended questions. So open-ended questions are typically going to be going to collect more qualitative-oriented data. So I believe I've talked about the forgiveness study that I did in this class, where I asked people, write about a time when someone hurt you in some way and they remorsefully apologized. And then I left a bunch of blank space for people to fill this out. This is really useful in social psychology as a sort of stimuli to put people into the mind frame of that, so that I could then ask them some quantitative questions later on. But you might just use this to learn more about a particular topic. So I'm working on some research having to do with social devaluation. And, it's sort of a relatively new idea that I'm working with. And so I might ask participants, when I say social devaluation, or when I say some groups in society are valued more or less than others, what does that make you think of? Or how do you respond to that? I'm exploring their answers to gain some insight into the topic that I'm working on. Closed-ended questions are ideal for quantitative research. The one thing I would say about open-ended questions is that you don't really want to use them for quantitative research because in order to do so, it's a very time-consuming task. You have to, if you have a bunch of open-ended responses, then you might have to code them for frequency. Well, how often do people mention this and how often do people mention that? And then you have to have independent coders code them so that you can have inter-rater reliability, which we talked about last time. And I ended up having to do that for this forgiveness paper. And let me tell you, it is a large amount of work to code a bunch of open-ended responses. So for quantitative work, we really like these closed-ended questions where participants can choose from a fixed set of answer choices. When you are creating these answer choices, you want to make sure that you use mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories. So if we're asking people their age, this scale here, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, this is not mutually exclusive or exhaustive, right? If I'm 10 years old, which of the two categories do I click on or select? 0 to 10 or 10 to 20, right? If I'm 35, there's no category for me. So you want to make sure that they're mutually exclusive, so they don't overlap at all. So less than 10, 10 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, right? These are mutually exclusive because they don't overlap. And you want to make sure that they're mutually exhaustive so that all possible answer choices are represented. The one thing that I would say, though, is that generally speaking, you never, ever want to create categories artificially to represent continuous data. So for example, if we're looking at age right here, if we break up the age into these categories, 18 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, what we're going to end up with is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 possible options that participants could fit into. The ideal way to do this would be to just ask them to indicate their age. And when you ask them to indicate their age, you're going to get a continuous measure with a ton of variability. For these categories, you're sort of artificially categorizing things and sort of reducing the amount of variability. So as a general rule, it is always better to ask continuous data questions than to artificially categorize continuous data. You also want to think about the different kinds of rating scales you're going to use if you're going to use closed-ended questions. Typically they're numerical, sort of your 1 to 10, 0 to 7, whatever scales. They can be endpoints anchored, so very low, very high. How favorable do you feel towards political candidate A? 7, very favorable, 1, very not unfavorable. You can also use fully anchored scales where you label every single option, strongly agree, strongly disagree, neutral agree, strongly agree. These are options in Qualtrics and SurveyMonkey. They're relatively easy to use. But oftentimes, when you are writing your IRB application to get approval for your study, or when you are preparing a thesis proposal or a dissertation proposal where you're preparing a Word document, you are going to have to create a document, a survey document that's going to have these kinds of anchors and these rating scales in there. And so a bit of advice on how to do that to save yourself a lot of heartache. You'll notice that, I'm just going to hit escape here. So you'll notice that these 1s and 2s, these are all just kind of spaced out using the space bar. And this is spaced out using the space bar and some tab keys. And this is really problematic. You can imagine yourself, you've got your entire thesis proposal done, you've spent hours hitting the space bar just enough times to get your survey to look just right, your questionnaire to look just right, and then your advisor comes in and says, you know what, I think you need to add another paragraph here about this, and when you add that paragraph in, it moves the spacing down and everything gets messed up. Doing the spacing and the tabs, that's not the way to go about this. The way to go about this is using a table in Microsoft Word. And I'll show you this in Excel or in PowerPoint, but it works the same in Microsoft Word. So when you want to create one of these rating scales, the best way to do this is to go to Insert and then choose Table. And if I've got a 4-point rating scale here, I'll choose a 2x4 table like this. Once you have the 2x4 table like this, you can format the background. So down here on Format Shape, we can format the background to no fill. Oops. And click Close. Oh, and of course, it only did it for one cell. So we'll do it for the whole thing. Format the background to no fill. So now we've got this. We can add in our borders so that we can see what we're doing. So we can go ahead and add in our 1, 2, 3, our strongly disagree, strongly agree. And then once we have that, we can go back and we can get rid of those borders. So now it looks like a nice scale. And if I need to move things around, oops, well, I guess that's not moving around. But if I need to move things around, it's relatively easy to do so, and it all stays together in one nice, neat table. Trust me when I say from experience, using tables when you are putting questionnaires together in a Word document is absolutely 100% the way to go. So for questionnaires, when we're dealing with abstract constructs, we often want to use a lot of different kinds of items to assess the same construct. So for example, if you look in your book at the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, there are 10 different questions that they use to measure self-esteem. And then when we do our quantitative analysis with those questions, we actually average the responses together to get a single number to represent your level of self-esteem. And this is because constructs like self-esteem or aggression, these things are multifaceted and they have lots of different pieces and parts. And so when you're developing a questionnaire or when you're looking for a questionnaire for your thesis or for a research study, you want to look for questionnaires that cover all the different facets of the construct that you're interested in. Now, typically, and this is not just for questionnaire construction, but this is just for research in general, multiple methods are always preferential to using a single method to measure something. So if I'm trying to measure self-esteem, I might ask the Rosenberg self-esteem, but I also might have participants take an implicit self-esteem measure, which is a reaction time task that sort of in short will have participants respond to the pairing of their name or their picture and the word good. And they'll have them respond to the pairing of their name and their picture and the word bad and other associated good, bad words. And we can get a sense of how strongly they associate themselves with the idea of good or positive self-esteem. And this is a reaction time measure that occurs at, in less than a second. We get, thousands of seconds worth of data. And if we can combine both of these things together, we can get a better picture of self-esteem, for example. Your book says use caution when you reverse word items because to prevent response set in multi-item scales. So a response set is when participants ignore the question really, and they just mark sevens. So you can think of so for example, I have some questions that I do research with looking at explicit prejudice. And explicit prejudice is like outright, blatant, old-fashioned prejudice. And so it might, the first question might be, how much do you agree with the following statement? I don't like black people very much. And so the participant might say, well, I'm not racist, and mark 1, strongly disagree. But then the next question, if it's reverse coded, which it is, it would say, I hold black people in high regard. So if I'm not paying attention, if I just look at that first question, I'm like, oh, this is about prejudice, and I'm not prejudiced, so I'm just going to mark 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, right? And so that would be problematic for our research. But what's useful about reverse coding is that we can identify these people who are responding in a specific direction, and we can exclude them from our analysis. So your book cautions against reverse coding, but this is very commonly done. And it's a way of identifying people who are, we call them acquiescent responders, people who are just sort of going sevens down the line, people who aren't really reading the questions very carefully. They also mention that reverse wording will reduce reliability and validity of scales, but I don't necessarily agree with that because one thing that we do when we do our analysis is we recode the reverse coded items so that all of the questions higher numbers mean the same thing. So for example, if we wanted that explicit prejudice questionnaire higher numbers to mean more prejudice, we would reverse code the I hold black people in high regard question. So if the participant put a 7, yes, I do hold black people in high regard, then we would reverse that to be a 1, which would indicate that it's still low prejudice. So it says use caution. You just have to more be aware of this when you're preparing to do your analysis. How are you looking at? I have that in there. So you want the questionnaire to be organized and easy for the participant to use, especially if you have piping questions or if you have questions that might not apply to all participants. You want to have clear directions. So maybe you've got questions about parenting, but not all of your participants are going to be parents. So you might have a filter question that says, are you a parent? If no, then skip to question 25 and make it clear where to skip to. So that you have easy, organized survey questions. Pilot test. Always pilot test. A pilot test is like a mini study that we do before we spend time to do the full-blown study. There's nothing worse than spending a year collecting data and then realizing you forgot a question. Or if you're doing your survey online, realizing that one of your experimental conditions was not included in the random assignment script, and then you just didn't get any of that data. So you always want to pilot test. Make sure that everything's working properly. Make sure people aren't having problems filling out the study. And then you just want to use the results of that pilot test to help revise if necessary. Now, we've talked about a bunch of different methods of data collection. So we talked about tests. We just talked about questionnaires. We also have interviews, focus groups, observational data, and secondary data. And so for the rest of this lecture, which is now moving on to Chapter 9, we're going to focus on the interviews, focus groups, and observation. The fundamental principle of mixed research suggests that the ideal for scientific evidence is to have multiple research methods addressing a similar topic in multiple different ways. Because converging evidence is always much stronger than a single piece of evidence. And especially because all different research methodologies have various strengths and weaknesses. So for example, the strength of an experiment is that it allows us to very strictly control all aspects of the study so that we can make conclusions about causality. The weaknesses of experimentation are that they are very artificial. They don't have what we would talk about as external validity or ecological validity. Right? They don't really necessarily represent how people behave in the real world. On the other hand, observational studies, you don't have a lot of control. You're not doing an experiment. These real people reacting in the real world, and there's no real control that you have. So you can't get information about causality. But if you have a research program where you do an experiment and you show a relationship between X and Y, and then you say, look, I went out in the world and I also observed the relationship between X and Y out in the world. That combined evidence, that mixed research evidence, provides a much stronger case because the strengths of the experiment outweigh the weaknesses of observation and vice versa. So we want to use these mixed methods whenever possible. Now, an interview is, as it sounds, we ask people questions. There are a variety of different ways that we can do this. You want to have a comfortable rapport with the person that you're interviewing. And you may also want to use probing questions. So if someone just doesn't give you all of the information that you think they might have, you can ask follow-up questions. Is there anything else? Do you have other reasons? What do you mean? There's a nice table in the textbook regarding how to conduct interviews. Um, Quantitative interviews, or sometimes we talk about this as a structured interview, is a standardized interview. And in a standardized interview, typically what's going to happen is the interviewer is going to be reading from a script. They're going to have a protocol for exactly what they're going to say, exactly how they're going to say it. And what's useful about this is that each participant experiences the same exact interview. And so what that allows for is a more mixed approach where we can ask interview closed-ended questions. We can ask them rate on a scale of 1 to 10. We can also ask open-ended questions. But because every interview participant experiences the same exact interview, we can then compare their answers later on. In contrast, informal conversational interviews are spontaneous. You can think about this almost as a regular conversation that you're having. It's very exploratory, and you allow the participant to sort of focus on what they think is important. And you record the interview, and then you go back and look at it later. You'll get the broadest set of perspectives in this fashion, but you won't have any sort of quantitative analysis that you can do. You won't be able to go back and code for any quantitative analysis. This is really reserved for sort of purely exploratory kind of research. The interview guide approach is more structured than the informal conversational interview. So you do have a protocol. There are certain questions that you do need to ask, but it's a loose framework. So you can ask them in any order. You can change the wording around. You can go back to questions. There's a set of questions that you're going to try and get through, but how you say them or in what order, it doesn't really matter. The standardized open-ended interview is more like a quantitative interview where you're asking the same exact questions in the same exact orders. And again, this is useful because you can compare responses. Now, a focus group is different than a structured interview. You can think about it as sort of like a group interview where there's a moderator whose job it is to sort of keep the group focused on the particular topic of under investigation. So focus groups are really useful for exploring ideas, but also getting more in-depth information. And the thing that's useful about focus groups is that, focus groups are really useful when people don't necessarily already have an opinion about a topic or experience with a topic. So, for example, if you ask anyone on the street, how do they feel about the current election, most people will have an opinion about this. But if you have a brand new cell phone app or a brand new television show that no one's ever seen before, no one can have an interview about, or no one can have an opinion about that already. And so focus groups are really useful because they provide sort of a safe, accepting environment and that allows people to form an opinion sort of in real time with feedback from other people, right? So you're thinking about the show you just watched, and other people are talking about it, and that makes you think of another thing, and it helps to sort of develop an opinion in real time. I have a link here, and I posted a couple PDF files to Sakai about both focus groups and interviews, if you are interested. Now, we talk about observational research. We want our observational research to be empirical, so we want it to be systematic and direct. We have to think about in advance exactly what behavior we're going to be observing, where it's going to take place, how are we going to record the information, are we going to videotape it, are we just going to have coders to code on a coding sheet, and we need to have precise operational definitions. When you're doing observational research, especially if you're doing it on the fly, you're not sort of videotaping it, You need to have clear operational definitions for what constitutes an aggression. So, for example, if you're observing children on a playground, you need to come out and clearly state in advance these are the behaviors that we will count as aggression, and they only count as aggression if we observe them in this way where we view X, Y, and Z, where it's very clear exactly what counts and what doesn't. Because the idea behind observational research, quantitative observational research, is that you want to train research assistants in such a way that two people can look at the same exact scene and they will code it in the exact same way. Two people will look at the same exact scene and they will say, yes, that was aggression, or no, that wasn't aggression. And this is what helps to get us good inter-rater reliability. Now, there's a couple different ways we can do observational research. We can do naturalistic observation. You can sort of think of this as akin to camping out in the bushes with binoculars and a clipboard. You're observing natural world, people, people behaving in the world, normal behavior, but you're not changing anything. You're not intervening. You're not doing anything to the environment, right? You're not involved at all. This is really useful for describing quote unquote normal behavior or how people behave in their day-to-day lives. And this can be really useful for showing external validity of lab findings. We talked about this with mixed research. Now, psychological research and perhaps some educational research might involve some kind of intervention. And there's a few different kinds of interventions we can do: participant, structured, and field. So participant observation is when the observer is actually an active participant in the setting that they're observing. And you can be undisguised or disguised. So in an undisguised observation, people know they're being observed. So an example of this is, as a professor, periodically I will be evaluated by my department chair. And so when I'm giving a lecture, my department chair will sit up in the back of the room, and I know that I am being observed. A disguised participant would be a little different, right? Maybe my department chair has an office assistant that I don't know come and sit in the back of the classroom and observe me. And in this case, I don't know that I'm being observed. Now, there are problems with participant observation, right? If you've ever been in that classroom where the professor was being observed, you may have noticed that the professor behaved a little differently than they normally do. Sometimes, oftentimes, people change their behavior when they know that they are being watched. And we call this reactivity. Disguised participant observation can help control for reactivity. But disguised participant observation can be problematic because if you spend too much time as a disguised participant, you can sort of lose objectivity. You can sort of think about the undercover cop who's in too deep. The undercover cop is sort of the disguised participant. Also, you may inadvertently influence the behavior of the people you're observing, especially if you're aware of the hypotheses or the research questions. You may accidentally or inadvertently influence people's behavior. Structured observation is a situation where we actually set up a particular scenario to observe people's behavior. So researchers will use confederates to structure situations. A confederate is someone who's like an actor. They work with the researcher. So, for example, some researchers were interested to know if how someone is dressed will influence how long and how much help they receive. And so what they did was they had a person dressed sort of shabbily in dirty, crumpled clothing and lay on the ground outside of a busy train station. And they recorded the number of people who stopped to help this person. And as you can imagine, most people didn't stop to help this person. Then they took that same person and they dressed them up in a clean business suit and had them lay on the ground and make sounds as if they were in pain, just as before. And almost immediately, people rushed to help this person. Okay. Now we could talk about why that happened, but that's a different lecture. But the point here is that this is a structured observation, right? We're using a confederate to create a scenario so that we can observe how people respond in this particular scenario. Um, One problem with using confederates is the confederates themselves are part of the research. They're part of the research stimuli, and so they need to use the same exact procedures and behave in exactly the same way every single time. Because if they don't, that adds noise to our data and reduces reliability. Then we can do structured observation. Here's another example of structured observation. I'll leave this link here, but you can watch it if you like and get a sense. But effectively, they have a person ask someone for directions on a busy street, and then they surreptitiously swap that person out for a completely different person to see how many people notice. This is based in real research. This is the video is from a television show, so it only shows like the most ridiculous instances. But typically, people will not notice when the person changes, somewhere in the neighborhood about 30% of the time. Now, last observation with involvement is a field experiment. So this is where we manipulate an independent variable in a natural setting and observe some dependent variable in that natural setting. So you have two or more conditions. You can use confederates to create these conditions. So for example, I may have mentioned a study that I'm particularly fond of that came out back in the 90s that showed that people take longer to pull out of a parking spot when someone is waiting for that spot compared to when no one is waiting. And you might say, well, I know that. I've experienced that in my life, right? Well, what they did is they went a step further and they did a field experiment where they sat in a mall parking lot and they randomly assigned people to one of four conditions. So either there was no one waiting for the spot, or one of the confederates drove by the participant, or one of the confederates pulled up behind the participant and turned on their blinker and waited for their spot, or fourth condition, the confederate pulled up behind the person, turned on their blinker, waited a few seconds, and then honked. As you can imagine, we had an interaction effect where people took longer overall when there was someone waiting for the spot, but they took even longer when the person honked. Okay. Now, this is a field experiment because the people in the experiment, they didn't know that they were part of an experiment, right? All they know is that someone just drove by their car or someone pulled up behind is waiting for their spot. But the researchers are creating an experiment in the natural world. And so this is really useful, again, for providing this level of control. You get this sort of random assignment piece. And it's really good to sort of help establish some validity of the observational findings that they had with their prior studies. I'm going to ignore this example because I forget what it's about. So when we record, we have to think about how we record. Generally speaking, video recording is always the best when we're doing observational research. And the reason is that we can, it allows us to do our observations at a later date and then re-watch them if we have any questions or if we think we might have missed something. You want to think about how you're going to collect your data. Remember earlier we talked about statistical analysis and quantitative studies. The way that you record your data will ultimately influence the kind of analyses that you can do. And so you want to sort of think about that as you are putting your study together. Things we do need to be concerned about is reactivity, so people changing their behavior because they know that they're being watched, but also demand characteristics, which is when people are looking to you, the researcher, are looking to the situation for information about how they should behave. Like they're not sure, so they want to look to you, and that's problematic because that might influence or bias their behavior. We also want to We also can run into problems with observers having expectations about behaviors, so only looking at particular behaviors. We talk about this as observer bias. So systematic errors that result from expectations So you expect, because of stereotypes, you expect that the black children are going to be more aggressive than the white children or the Hispanic children. And so when you're doing your observations, that stereotype that you may hold could inadvertently influence how you're observing that aggressive behavior. And incidentally, in social psychology, we talk about this. These biases are not necessarily explicit biases. So one might be aware of that stereotype just by existing in the culture, and that awareness of that stereotype may actually influence observation at a subconscious level, sort of outside your level of awareness. Now, one way we can get around this is by keeping observers blind to different aspects of the study. So why we're doing the observations, what the hypotheses are, what the goals are. You always want to have your observers as blind as they can be. That way you can rule out any observer bias. So that's it for observational research, chapters 8 and 9. As always, you can email me if you have any questions.